Hello everyone, and welcome to what I hope is the last one of these videos on this question, the big 30 mark long form TV drama question. Well done for persevering this long. This is video 4 of 4. Hopefully it won't be a very long video because you will be familiar with writing paragraphs now, and we just need to finish this off. So let's do that. Remind ourselves of the question. The differences in the codes and conventions of long-form TV dramas reflect the different values, attitudes, and beliefs of the audiences that consume them. How far do you agree with this statement? So far, you've done a plan, you've had a look at your introduction, you've done an audience paragraph, you've also looked at the industry. Now we're going to go on to today, representations, so the difference between how characters are represented, for example, Sarah Lund versus Jan Meyer and Charles Hartman in The Killing, and the difference between Denmark in 2007 versus the US in 1980. We're also, within that paragraph, going to be thinking about some of the other contexts that we haven't spoken about, so political and cultural contexts. And we're also going to be starting to think a little bit about media language, because we haven't spoken about media language yet. So that's all going to be in this paragraph here. We're going to, again, talk a little bit about theorists. So we've talked about Neil with genre hybridization. We're going to talk about Hesmond Halch, and we're going to talk about Judith Butler as well, very briefly. And then we're going to come to a conclusion. So that's the plan today. So your introduction looks something like this. Your first paragraph looks something like this. Your second paragraphs on industry look something like this. And now let's move on to paragraph number 4. So this is representation, or a representation paragraph. And again, I'll repeat what I've said previously. It doesn't have to look like this, but this is my interpretation, and you can take it or leave it. But this is the sort of thing that I'd expect you to be writing. So let's go through it. The content is also influenced by the cultural background of the audiences. Many of the Stranger Things millennial audience was brought up with the films of Steven Spielberg and the books of Stephen King. Harnessing this nostalgia, the Duffer Brothers used intertextual relay throughout Season 1, Episode 1, with references to Alien, the depiction of the Demogorgon, The Goonies, the finding of Eleven in the Woods, E.T., with the children's bikes, and The Shining, the presence of an unknown supernatural force. The adults who knew and loved the 80s are naturally drawn to these narrative strands, while younger viewers are introduced to these narrative patterns. The repetition of these narrative patterns throughout time is a key focus of Hesmond Hoff's theory, who argues that big firms like Netflix have to reproduce well-used narratives in order to mitigate risk and ensure market success. So, just a quick reminder of our assessment objectives. Essentially, assessment objective 1 is your knowledge and your understanding, and assessment objective 2 is how you apply your argument. So, the first bit here is about the knowledge of the of Stranger Things in this particular paragraph, and then the second half is applying your argument to it. So let's see what we've done here. Well, we've given some specific detail. I said of industry there, but what I mean is of the program itself. So you've watched it, you've done your research on it, and you know that there are intertextual references to all of these films: Alien, The Goonies, E.T. These are just some examples, but there are plenty others there as well. Nightmare on Elm Street, and The Evil Dead 2. So those are some examples you can use, but essentially it is information that you have gleaned to show that you understand where the references, the intertextual references, have come from for Stranger Things. So that satisfies AO1. In AO2, as you remember, it talks about you need to talk about your overall argument. So we need to go back to the keywords of the question. In this respect, I'm talking about the audience. So why have I given this big list of old films? Well, it's because the audience who are going to be watching Stranger Things will be familiar with these texts, and therefore the Duffer Brothers are harnessing their nostalgia and therefore increasing their fan base. But because Netflix is such a huge company, it's no good just attracting millennials. They've got to also attract a new generation to these narrative strands. But as opposed to making new storylines, what Netflix have done is they've decided to reproduce or recreate these narrative patterns, which fits in perfectly with Hesmanhoff's theory, who argues that Netflix has to do that in order to mitigate risk and ensure market success. So I've put a little bit of theory in here. So just to explain what we've got, your argument here using the keywords, your specific bits of information, and then why that's useful to your argument with a bit of theory in there. So over to you, your Stranger Things paragraph on representation, please, and the cultural context. Can you write that now? Pause the video here. So moving on to representation in The Killing then, and we're also going to put some political context in here. I'm going to talk about Sarah Lund here, but also Jan Meyer, as I said in my plan. So the narrative of The Killing is similar to that of Stranger Things, namely the disappearance of a child. But DR have chosen to focus on the domestic interactions of the adults, whereas The Killing takes on the point of view of the children. Lund breaks the stereotype of the hard-nosed male police detective, which is filled by Meyer and Hopper throughout both shows, adhering to Judith Butler's theory of gender performativity. Let's just stop there and have a look at what we've got here, because there's quite a lot of information here. So I've tried to include a little bit of media language here because we've talked about representation, we've talked about audience, we've talked about industry. We haven't got a lot of media language in here. So I've tried to put it in here by talking about the point of view of the children. So that is media language. We're talking about a camera shot. We're talking about a perspective here. So we're talking about the difference between The Killing and Stranger Things. Well, Stranger Things is told through the point of view of the children, and The Killing is from the point of view of the adults. Looking back at this paragraph, maybe I could have put some more media language in. Maybe I could have talked about the panning shot when Sarah Lund is thinking, showing that she sort of sees the whole picture, which again breaks the stereotype of the traditionally male police detective. Maybe I could have talked about her clothes, that knitted Nordic jumper being almost like her uniform, her protection. Maybe I could have talked about the sound as well, which would fit into media language. When Lund is thinking, there is that sound motif, which makes us think that she is thinking in a higher plane than anybody else. Anyway, any of those things you could have popped in there to talk about media language. I've popped a little bit of Butler's theory in here only because we've only done it recently in our question 4 question. And I've spoken about Meyer and Hopper. Now, Meyer and Hopper would have been your traditional detective in that they're supposed to be the people who are in charge. But actually, in both of these productions, Meyer and Hopper are a little bit disappointing. They're a bit anti-heroic. And therefore adhering to Judith Butler's theory of gender performativity, suggesting that actually, just because someone is a male or a female doesn't mean they are better at their job or worse at their job, as exemplified by Meyer, Hopper, and indeed Sarah Lund. So that's why I popped that in there. Okay, moving on. Both shows are set in a tumultuous political time. The Killing in the wake of the recent Danish elections, in which a coalition was formed, comprising a previously right-wing party. Stranger Things is set in the 1980s, at a time of government skepticism and a fear of the unknown. Both of these fears are represented in the Demogorgon in Stranger Things and in the shady characterization of Charles Hartman in The Killing. So, a little bit of political context here. I've tried to explain the difference between Denmark in 2007 and the US in the 1980s. Again, talking about media language here, you could go into the fact that this is a period drama. It's set in the 1980s, and therefore the set has to look a particular way. The characters need to dress in a particular way, so you could talk a little bit more about media language there if you wanted. I wanted to talk about the 1980s because, as you know from your introduction lessons, it was a time of government skepticism and the fear of the unknown, and both of these are symbolized in the characterization, the Demogorgon. Then this political context about the Danish elections. Well, we know that Denmark was going through a strange transitionary time. A coalition was formed, which included a right-wing party, which was previously unheard of in Denmark. So we've got this sort of Denmark is in political flux, not really sure where it's going, and that's represented by Troels Hartmann, who is young and charismatic, but we're not quite sure how trustworthy he is, as exemplified by his link with the death of Nana Birk Larsen at the end of the episode. So, just to clarify, what have we got here? Well, we've got some detail in media language, some detail in cultural and political context and difference between the two times in which they're set, and then the explanation of how it can be linked to the question. So, pause the video here, give it a go as well. You're looking at the representation of the killing in this paragraph and some political contexts as well, if you can. So this is the slide we've all been waiting for, conclusion. Well done for watching all of these videos. I've been speaking for about 55 minutes over these 4 videos, and that's actually how long you should be writing your piece for, between 50 and 55 minutes. So I'm making no apologies for sort of stranding this out and explaining in the way that I have, because it is such an important question. But anyway, let's get on to the conclusion. Now, in the mark scheme, it says that part of AO2 is reaching judgments and conclusions. So you really have to have a conclusion in order to get up to those top marks. How you start the paragraph is up to you, but you must signpost what it is you're doing here. But let's read through it first. Overall, the codes and conventions of Stranger Things and The Killing reflect the different values, attitudes, and beliefs of their key audiences. 1, a global mass audience, 1, a niche Danish audience. Stranger Things uses genre hybridization, repetition of narratives, and Netflix bingeability format to attract a mass audience. So The Killing sticks to the hard-hitting, serious storylines and narratives commonplace in Nordic noir, and appeal to their culturally sophisticated ABC One, Danish, and international audiences. The difference in production values represent the different ownership structures of Netflix and DR. Okay, so this is what you need to do in your conclusion. Start off your sentence with overall, or in conclusion, or something that says to your examiner that this is the end and these are my ideas. And essentially what you're going to do is you are going to start off looking back to the question and using the keywords and explaining the rationale behind your answer. So the keywords, values, attitudes, and beliefs of the key audiences. And then you're essentially going to summarize in one sentence or so each of your paragraphs. So if you remember, our first paragraph was about the mass versus the niche audiences. The next paragraph was about the difference in genre and genre hybridization and how Netflix was able to do it, and The Killing wasn't. So that's the next bit. We also talked about our difference in audiences, and I've put that in there as well. We talked about the difference in ownership structure, and I've put that in at the end. So if I'm going to break this down, I've repeated the question and I've summarized each of my 4 or 5 paragraphs in my conclusion, and that's all you need to do. So summarize the main point of each of your paragraphs, the differences in audience in this respect, ownership, and the cultural differences. And that is how you write a good 30-mark answer. Pause the video here, write your conclusion as usual, add it to your original blog post or the email that you have sent your teachers. Thank you for persevering with this. We are going to get you to do a practice one of these in the next few lessons, and I'll again do a YouTube video on what that will be. But in the meantime, good luck with this. Let me know if you have any questions or queries. All the best. Stay safe.